Part 1. A Day in the Life of a Multi-Species Planet. The alarm goes off. You reach for your phone. The news feed looks familiar. War, weather, sports, politics. But the faces are different. You scroll past a construction crew pouring concrete on a highway overpass. The workers are short, maybe 5'4", but their chests are wide as barrels and their forearms are thicker than your thighs. They move rebar like it weighs nothing. The foreman standing beside them, taller, thinner, unmistakably your kind, has to shout instructions twice because the crew speaks a language that sounds half-spoken, half-performed, full of gestures and low tonal shifts you can barely follow. They are Neanderthals, and they have been building things longer than your civilization has existed. You flip to the morning news. A Denisovan mountaineer is being interviewed about a Himalayan rescue. She pulled 3 climbers out of a crevasse at 22,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. Her face is broad, her cheekbones high, and she speaks with a calm that suggests the thin air up there feels like sea level to her. It does. Her ancestors have lived above the clouds for over 100,000 years, and her blood carries a gene that processes oxygen in ways your body simply cannot replicate. Your kid's school just hired a new teaching aide on the island of Flores. She is 3 feet 7 inches tall. She navigates a classroom designed for children twice her size with a patience and precision that her students adore. She is Homo floresiensis, one of the people the locals still call by the old name, the little ones, and her kind has been part of this island for longer than your entire species has existed. Somewhere in the European Parliament, a politician is giving a speech about border policy in the hybrid zones. Look closely. The brow ridge is heavier than you would expect on a sapien's face. The jawline is sharper. She is a hybrid, part sapiens, part Neanderthal, and she represents a frontier district where the two species have been mixing for longer than anyone can remember. Half the chamber does not think she should be there. The other half voted for her specifically because she understands both worlds. She is used to both kinds of stare. This is Monday morning on a planet with 9 kinds of human being. Welcome to the world that almost was. Homo sapiens still dominate. There are roughly 5 to 6 billion of you, instead of the 8 billion in the world you actually know. You share the planet with approximately 30 to 50 million Neanderthals, concentrated in northern Europe, the Caucasus, and the edges of Siberia. 10 to 20 million Denisovans hold the Tibetan Plateau and the highland ranges of Central and Southeast Asia. Scattered populations of Homo erectus, hundreds of thousands, maybe a few million, persist across tropical Asia. Island enclaves of Floresiensis and their cousins Homo luzonensis survive in the Indonesian and Philippine archipelagos, numbering in the tens of thousands each. Homo naledi occupies southern African cave systems in small, secretive communities, and in remote refugia, from highland Ethiopia to isolated Pacific islands, there are trace populations that do not fit neatly into any category, the descendants of lineages we barely understand, the ghost branches of a family tree that never stopped branching. Your numbers are lower because you never had the planet to yourself. Agriculture is still a sapiens innovation. No other species independently developed it. Because agriculture requires abstract planning, delayed gratification across seasons, and the kind of large-scale social coordination that only sapiens networking makes possible. You still invented cities and writing and empires, but your expansion hit walls that our world never encountered. Neanderthal-held forests in northern Europe were not cleared for your farmland because the people living in those forests could and did fight back, and they knew the terrain better than any invading army ever would. Denisovan highlands were not terraced for your crops because the altitude killed your workers before they could finish the first terrace. Island species kept their ecosystems intact because the water between islands was a moat that no army before the age of sail could reliably cross. Erectus communities along Southeast Asian river systems did not simply move aside when your traders arrived. They had been there for 1 million years, and 1 million years of occupancy creates a claim that is difficult to argue with, even in sapiens' legal terms. You built civilization, but you built it in the spaces between other civilizations that were already there, and the negotiations were not always polite. Sometimes they were conducted with spears. This is not a utopia. It is not a dystopia either. It is messy. the way every real society with multiple peoples and languages and histories is messy. Except here the differences go past culture, past language, past tradition. They go down to the bone, to the brain, to the genome. Some species have full legal personhood in some countries. Others are still fighting for it. Some live in your cities, working alongside you, eating in the same restaurants, riding the same buses, and you barely notice anymore, because you grew up with this, and your parents grew up with this, and their parents before them. Some want nothing to do with sapient society, and have retreated to territories where they live on their own terms, as they have for hundreds of thousands of years. Some occupy a grey zone between citizen and protected species that satisfies no one, too intelligent to be classified as animals, too different to be given a voting card. And then there are the Naledi. You almost never see them. They live underground, in the cave systems of southern Africa, in communities that may be partially nocturnal, with social structures so foreign to sapiens' experience that the anthropologists who study them admit they are mostly guessing. The few photographs that exist show small-bodied people with hands built for climbing and faces that look simultaneously ancient and alive. They do not give interviews. They did not ask to be studied. Their relationship with the sapiens world above them is something between coexistence and mutual bewilderment. And here is the part that matters. This scenario is not fantasy. It is not science fiction dressed up in footnotes. A study published in November of 2025 in Scientific Reports showed that Neanderthal extinction required no war, no superiority, no grand conquest. The dilution model built by Amadei, Lin and Fattorini demonstrated that it needed only the slow demographic math of a larger population absorbing a smaller one over 10 to 30,000 years. No violence necessary, no cognitive advantage necessary, just numbers. The quiet arithmetic of two populations overlapping, interbreeding at low rates, and the smaller one gradually dissolving into the larger one, the way a drop of ink dissolves into a glass of water. Change the migration pattern slightly, send fewer sapiens north, or send them later, or send them along a different river valley, and the math changes, and the Neanderthals survive. A separate study published in December of 2025 in Communications, Earth and Environment showed that the hobbits on Flores were killed by a prolonged drought that cut summer rainfall in half between 61,000 and 55,000 years ago. Sapiens arrived at their cave around 46,000 years ago, after the hobbits were already gone. Remove that drought, and they hold their island to this day. This is the road not taken. One slight change in the weather, one different turn in a migration route, one drought that lasted 5,000 years fewer, and the world fills with cousins instead of emptying of them. The bones in the ground are not ancient history. They are the neighbours we almost had. Before we can understand how 9 species navigate 2026 together, we need to understand who controls what, and why geography decided everything before any of them had a say in the matter. Part 2. The geopolitical map. Who controls what and why? Picture a map. Not the one you know. This one has borders drawn by biology as much as by politics. The Neanderthals hold the cold places: Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the Alps, the Urals, the Caucasus, Highland Scotland, and the edges of the Siberian taiga. These are their territories, and they have occupied them for hundreds of thousands of years. Their bodies were built for it, cold-adapted, barrel-chested, short-limbed, carrying bone density and muscle mass that makes the strongest sapiens look fragile by comparison. A male Neanderthal standing 5'4" could overpower a sapiens twice his height in a grapple without breaking a sweat. Their metabolism demanded up to 4,480 calories a day, which means they needed territory packed with megafauna, large animals, protein on the hoof. And here is a detail that should surprise you. Mammoths still exist in their territory. Neanderthal populations were never large enough to overhunt them. At their peak, only about 200,000 Neanderthals occupied all of Eurasia at any given time. They could not generate the coordinated hunting pressure that sapiens networks eventually would. So the mammoths survived, and the Neanderthals survived alongside them, the way they had for 400,000 years. Their nations are not nations in the way you understand them. They are loose confederations of small bands, maybe 10 to 30,000 individuals per regional grouping, bound by kinship and territory, rather than by abstract concepts like sovereignty or constitution. There are no Neanderthal flags, no Neanderthal anthems, no Neanderthal parliaments. They resist centralized government because their social architecture does not support it. They think in clans, not in countries. Think less like a country and more like an indigenous territory with negotiated borders. Except these people have genuine military parity in their terrain. A Neanderthal in close quarters winter combat in familiar forest is functionally overwhelming without firearms. No sapiens general wants to send infantry into a Scandinavian winter to fight them. The smart ones never tried. Now look east and up. The Denisovans hold the roof of the world, the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush, and possibly the Ethiopian highlands. They split from Neanderthals roughly 640,000 years ago and adapted to altitudes where the air itself tries to kill you. They carry a gene called EPAS1, which modern Tibetans inherited from them through ancient interbreeding. This gene regulates the body's response to low oxygen, allowing carriers to produce less hemoglobin at altitude, which dramatically reduces pregnancy complications and infant mortality above 4,000 meters. No sapiens population can match this without generations of acclimatization. The Denisovans visited by sheer karst cave on the Tibetan Plateau, over 3,200 meters up, multiple times between 160,000 and 60,000 years ago, making them possibly the earliest high-altitude inhabitants among all human species. They are small in number, but enormous in leverage. They control the headwaters of every major Asian river, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Ganges, the Indus, the Brahmaputra. Billions of sapiens downstream depend on water that flows from Denisovan territory. Every rice paddy in southern China, every irrigation canal in northern India, every hydroelectric dam on the Mekong, all of it depends on water that originates in mountains where Denisovans have lived since before sapiens existed as a species. This makes them geopolitically indispensable, in the same way Switzerland is indispensable, small, mountainous, strategically vital, and very, very hard to invade. An army that marches uphill into thin air against defenders who breathe normally is an army that marches to its own funeral. Sapiens empires like China and India have always needed to negotiate with the Denisovans for water rights. Always. Every dynasty, every republic, every regime change, the first diplomatic mission always goes to the mountains, because the mountains were there before any of them and will be there after all of them are gone. You do not go to war with the people who control your drinking water. You smile and you negotiate and you pay whatever price they name, because the alternative is watching your civilization die of thirst. Homo erectus occupies the tropical lowlands of Southeast Asia, mainland forests, river systems, and coastal zones. They are the longest surviving human species in the fossil record, spanning nearly 2 million years in our timeline. They had fire, they had stone tools. They may have been seafarers for over 1 million years. Stone tools on Flores date back that far, across a sea crossing of more than 9 kilometers, and tools on Socotra and Crete suggest an ongoing maritime culture that predates every other ocean-crossing species on Earth. Their brains averaged around 950 cubic centimeters, about 75% of a sapien's brain. They are the most widespread non-sapien species, but also the most vulnerable because they occupy the same warm lowlands that sapiens prefer, the river valleys, the coastal plains, the fertile ground where cities want to be built. Their story is the most colonial one, displaced, exploited, pushed into marginal land, and the parallels to indigenous peoples in our own timeline are direct and uncomfortable, except the cognitive differences here are real rather than invented by colonizers to justify what they were doing. In our timeline, colonizers had to fabricate biological inferiority. In this one, the gap in abstract reasoning is genuine, and that genuine gap makes the exploitation easier to justify and harder to stop. The island species, Floresiensis on Flores, Luzonensis on Luzon, are protected by water. The same sea barriers that isolated Floresiensis for 700,000 years serve as their fortress now. Sovereign island territories, probably under international protection by 2026, with treaty rights negotiated by sapiens advocates on their behalf, which raises its own uncomfortable questions about who speaks for a species that does not speak your language. Floresiensis stood about 3 feet 7 inches, weighed around 25 kilograms, with brains roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, yet they made stone tools, hunted pygmy elephants, survived alongside Komodo dragons and a giant stork called Leptoptilus robustus that stood over 6 feet tall and almost certainly viewed them as prey. And they likely used fire. Luzonensis, under 4 feet tall, with curved toes like a creature from millions of years earlier, inhabited Kalau Cave on Luzon at least 50 to 67,000 years ago. And their bizarre mosaic of features, some modern, some ancient, suggests an evolutionary history that we have barely begun to understand. Homo naledi lurks in the southern African cave systems, curved fingers for climbing, deliberate body disposal 300 meters underground, through passages so narrow that only the smallest adults could navigate them, requiring fire for illumination in absolute darkness. Tiny brains of about 500 cubic centimeters that defy every assumption science has ever made about the relationship between brain size and behavioral complexity. Because everything we thought we knew about what a brain that size can do was based on chimpanzees, and Naledi are not chimpanzees. They are something else entirely, something we do not have a good framework for understanding. And in the frontier zones where species ranges overlap, the European lowlands, the Central Asian foothills, the Southeast Asian river deltas, millions of hybrids live in gradient communities that are 60-40 or 70-30, belonging fully to neither side, claimed by both and rejected by both in the same breath. And these are the most politically volatile places on Earth. The borders are drawn, but the real divide is not geography. It is what happens when 9 kinds of mind try to talk to each other. Part 3, Language, Communication and the Problem of 9 Kinds of Mind. You say, time is money, without thinking about it. You hear, love is a battlefield, and you understand it instantly. These are not poems. They are the foundation of abstract thought itself, and you do not even notice you are using them. Every financial system, every legal contract, every religious concept, every scientific theory depends on this one cognitive trick, taking one conceptual domain and projecting it onto another. Metaphorical mapping, the ability to say that one thing is like another thing, even when it physically is not. This ability traces to something specific about your skull. After Homo sapiens first appeared around 300,000 years ago, the skull gradually became more globular, rounder, more spherical. That rounding indicates increased neural connectivity, particularly between previously isolated semantic clusters in the brain. It means your brain can link ideas that have no obvious physical connection. Time and money, love and war, justice and a pair of scales, life and a journey. This connectivity is the hardware that makes metaphor possible, and metaphor is the engine that runs your entire civilization. Without it, you have no banking, no law, no science, no religion, at least not in the forms you recognize. Neanderthal brains were actually larger than yours, roughly 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to your 1,250. But size is not the whole story. Proportions matter far more. Their brains had a larger occipital lobe dedicated to visual processing, a smaller parietal lobe handling spatial awareness and problem solving, and a smaller, differently shaped cerebellum involved in language fluency and creativity. Once you correct for their larger body mass, that extra brain capacity was devoted primarily to vision and body maintenance. The current neuroscience consensus is carefully worded but significant. Neanderthals had language, concrete words and basic syntax, but their brain architecture featured isolated semantic clusters rather than the interconnected network sapiens have. They probably lacked metaphorical thinking. A Neanderthal can describe exactly what a wolf looks like, how it moves, where it hunts, what its pelt smells like after rain. They probably cannot say, that politician is a wolf, not because they are limited, because the conceptual bridge between politician and wolf requires neural wiring they do not have. Consider what Neanderthal speech actually sounded like. Their vocal tract anatomy was similar to ours. They had a hyoid bone much like a sapiens hyoid, but a narrower vertebral canal limited the precise breath control needed for rapid, fluent articulation. Speech would have been slower, possibly more tonal, and heavily supplemented by gesture. Their massive brow ridges limited eyebrow expressiveness, and sapiens, by contrast, evolved flatter brow ridges partly driven by a gene called BAZ1B, affecting neural crest cells, which gave us subtler social signalling through eyebrow movement. Without that tool, Neanderthals likely compensated with hand gestures, body posture, vocal pitch variation, and physical proximity. Imagine a language that is half spoken and half performed, every sentence accompanied by movement, every emphasis carried by the body as much as the voice. Beautiful, precise, and utterly foreign to a sapien's ear. The translation problem is where civilization gets complicated. Over centuries, sapiens developed pidgin languages for interspecies trade, simplified vocabularies tied to concrete objects and actions. These eventually evolve into full Creole languages with their own grammar and nuance, spoken in border markets and frontier towns where the species mix. But the core sapiens concepts, justice, democracy, rights, money, God, may remain literally untranslatable into Neanderthal cognition. Not because Neanderthals are unintelligent. They survived ice ages that would have killed you in a week. They are extraordinary in their own domain, but these concepts require metaphorical mapping that their brain architecture does not appear to support. Justice is not a thing you can touch. Democracy is not a thing you can see. Money is not the object itself, but what the object represents. Every layer of sapient civilization is built on this kind of abstraction, and every layer is therefore inaccessible, at least in its full form, to minds that do not process abstraction the same way. This creates a permanent asymmetry in every interaction, every negotiation, every treaty. Sapiens can partially learn Neanderthal communication. Because concrete language is a subset of abstract language, you can always go simpler. But Neanderthals may never fully grasp sapiens abstraction, because you cannot go more complex than your wiring allows. The political implications of that one-way street are staggering, and they are the foundation of everything we will discuss about rights and economics. The Denisovans might be the bridge. Having split from Neanderthals around 640,000 years ago, their cognitive architecture could sit somewhere between the two, more connective than Neanderthals, less generative than sapiens. Their wide geographic range, from the Altai Mountains in Siberia to the tropical caves of Laos to possibly the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and their survival until perhaps 15 to 30,000 years ago suggests a social complexity that exceeds anything Neanderthals achieved. They might be the best interspecies translators the world has ever produced, capable of grasping some sapiens abstractions and expressing them in forms that Neanderthal minds can process. If so, they become the most diplomatically important species on the planet, small in number, indispensable in function, the interpreters standing between two kinds of mind that cannot fully reach each other without help. Homo erectus likely had rudimentary speech, enough for cooperative hunting, probably not enough for storytelling or planning beyond the immediate future. Floresiensis, with chimpanzee-sized brains but 700,000 years of cultural evolution, might communicate through something more like augmented great ape communication. Gestures, vocalizations, facial expressions evolved far beyond anything chimpanzees achieve, but still rooted in the concrete, the here, the now. Naledi remains the total mystery, with possible symbolic behavior and brains 1/3 the size of yours. The digital age makes the divide worse, not better. Can a Neanderthal use a smartphone? Probably. Their superior visual processing might make them excellent with visual interfaces, swiping through image-heavy applications with an intuitive ease that sapiens users might envy. Could they navigate a platform built around 280 characters of abstract argument? Probably not. Could they understand a meme that requires 3 layers of ironic distance and a knowledge of sapiens pop culture to decode? Definitely not. The digital divide in the multi-species world is not about access to devices or internet connectivity. It is about the architecture of the mind using the device, and since every device was designed by a sapiens mind for sapiens minds, the architecture is always tilted in one direction. A Neanderthal with a smartphone is like a left-handed person using scissors designed for right-handed people. It works, but it never feels right, and the effort required is invisible to everyone who does not share the problem. And then there is the question nobody wants to ask out loud, but everyone in the multi-species world thinks about constantly.
If sapiens designed the technology, and sapiens control the platforms, and sapiens wrote the algorithms, then who is the internet really for? Every digital interface on Earth assumes a sapiens user. Every search engine ranks results by sapiens logic. Every recommendation algorithm is trained on sapiens preferences. The other species are not excluded by malice. They are excluded by architecture, the same way a building with only staircases excludes someone in a wheelchair, not because anyone hates them, but because no one thought about them when they drew the plans. And when you point this out, the architects look puzzled and say, "But staircases work fine." They do if you are the one they were built for. If you cannot think in metaphor, you cannot think in money. And that creates the most explosive economic question on the planet. Part 4, Economics. Who works, who builds, who profits. A piece of paper that represents value, credit, which is trust projected into the future. Corporations, legal fictions that do not physically exist anywhere. Stock markets, collective agreements about imaginary worth that fluctuate based on collective mood. Every single pillar of the modern economy requires abstract metaphorical thinking, which means every pillar of the modern economy is a sapiens invention running on sapiens cognitive architecture. The entire global financial system is, from a certain angle, one long metaphor that 7 billion people have agreed to believe in. Neanderthals, Denisovans and Erectus can participate in barter economies, gift economies, labour for goods exchanges. They understand trade at the concrete level. I give you this tool, you give me that meat, and we both walk away satisfied. But they may never independently develop banking, insurance, derivatives or venture capital, because these systems require you to believe in things that are not physically present. A Neanderthal can hold a coin. Whether a Neanderthal can understand that the coin represents something beyond itself, that it stands for a quantity of labour or a fraction of collective trust, that is a different question entirely. This is not a judgment about intelligence, it is a consequence of how different brains are wired, and it has consequences that touch every corner of economic life. The Neanderthal labour question is the defining economic justice issue of the multi-species world, and it should make you deeply uncomfortable. Neanderthals are physically the most powerful humans on the planet. Their bone density, muscle mass and skeletal robusticity make them extraordinary labourers. Mining, construction, heavy manufacturing, military close combat, any task where raw physical power determines the outcome. In a just world, this commands premium wages. In the actual world, and you can extrapolate this from every century of sapiens history involving the exploitation of physical labour, it invites exploitation. Are Neanderthal construction workers paid the same as sapiens workers doing the same job? Are they unionised? Can they understand a contract which is fundamentally an abstract commitment projected into the future? If they cannot, who advocates for them? Who makes sure they are not working 16-hour days for food and shelter, while a sapiens contractor pockets the profit? This question sits at the moral centre of the multi-species economy, and every answer creates new problems. The historical timeline writes itself, because it mirrors what actually happened in our world with different victims. Ancient sapiens empires almost certainly enslaved other species. Neanderthal miners in Roman quarries, hauling stone through tunnels no sapiens worker could match them in. Erectus agricultural labourers in Han Dynasty fields, clearing land and planting crops for masters who considered them draft animals with hands. Floresiensis household servants in Southeast Asian port cities, valued for their small size and careful fingers, and the fact that they ate almost nothing compared to a sapiens worker. The moral horror of it compounds with every century. The abolition of interspecies slavery becomes this world's equivalent of our abolition of racial slavery, fought over centuries, resisted violently by those who profited from it, and still incomplete even in 2026. There are nations in 2026 where the laws have changed but the practices have not, where Erectus labourers work in conditions that meet the legal definition of freedom, but not the moral one. The critical difference that keeps philosophers awake at night is this. Colonisers in our timeline invented biological inferiority to justify what they were doing. The differences were cosmetic. In the multi-species world, the cognitive differences are real. That makes the moral argument for equality both more urgent and infinitely more complicated, because you cannot pretend the differences do not exist, and pretending is what made abolition possible in our world, the argument that we are all the same underneath. In the multi-species world, they are not all the same underneath. The argument for equality has to rest on something other than sameness, and that is a much harder case to make to people who do not want to be convinced. The Denisovans occupy a completely different economic position. They own the mountains, and mountains contain things the modern world desperately needs. Mining rights to rare earth minerals in the Himalayas, the same minerals that go into every smartphone, every electric vehicle battery, every military guidance system. Water rights for rivers feeding billions of sapiens downstream, and they are the only humans who can work effectively above 4,000 meters without supplemental oxygen, high-altitude construction, telecommunications tower maintenance, mountain rescue operations, military deployments at elevations, where sapien soldiers vomit and faint within hours. Denisovans command a premium in every industry where altitude matters, and that leverage is permanent and non-negotiable. In the economic hierarchy of the multi-species world, they sit in a unique position, small in number, modest in technological development, but holding resources that every sapien superpower needs, which gives them a bargaining power that has nothing to do with GDP and everything to do with geography. Floresiensis island economies may be the most sustainable on Earth, small-bodied, adapted to scarcity, extraordinarily efficient in their use of every calorie and every resource their islands provide. Sapien sustainability researchers travel to study them the way engineering students visit a perfectly designed machine, to understand how a system can function indefinitely without consuming itself. But tourism pressure, resource extraction proposals and development interest constantly threaten their independence, because sapiens entrepreneurs see an untouched island and think opportunity the same way they have always thought opportunity when they encounter someone else's home. The GDP gap is the measurement problem that should keep economists honest but rarely does. Sapiens nations have vastly higher GDP because GDP measures abstract economic activity that sapiens cognition invented. By those metrics, every other species looks desperately poor. But Neanderthals who live in small bands and hunt megafauna and have no use for money are not poor. They eat better than most sapien city dwellers, they work fewer hours, they breathe cleaner air, and they have never experienced unemployment, because the concept does not exist in their world. They are operating a different economic logic entirely, one that has sustained them for 400,000 years without producing a single financial crisis. The multi-species world forces the question our world avoids. Are sapiens' economic metrics universal truths, or are they cultural artifacts we mistook for physics? Is GDP a measure of well-being, or is it a measure of how much abstract activity a particular kind of brain can generate? And if it is the latter, why are we using it to judge species whose brains generate a different kind of value? Silicon Valley is 100% sapiens. Every tech billionaire, every AI researcher, every venture capitalist. The technology gap between species is the economic gap, and it widens every decade. Artificial intelligence, software engineering, pharmaceutical research, genetic editing, space exploration, all built on layers of abstraction that require sapien-style neural connectivity to conceptualize, let alone execute. The multi-species world's richest individuals are all sapiens, without exception. The 100 largest corporations are all sapiens-founded and sapiens-run. The financial markets that determine the value of everything are sapiens constructions, operating on sapiens logic enforced by sapiens institutions. The other species participate in the global economy the way passengers participate in an airplane. They are inside the system. They benefit from it in some ways. They are moved by its forces, but they did not design it. They do not control it, and if it crashes, they have no access to the cockpit. The question is not whether this is fair. The question is whether any system can be fair when the fundamental cognitive tools are distributed unequally by biology itself. And that question has no answer that satisfies everyone, because the people asking it and the people answering it are all sapiens, using sapiens logic, in a sapiens language, to debate a problem that exists because sapiens cognition built the world in its own image. So if they cannot conceptualize money, can they conceptualize rights? This is where the conversation gets truly difficult. Part 5, the rights question. Personhood, citizenship, and the species line. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, specifies that its protections apply to human beings. Does Homo neanderthalensis qualify as a human being? That question is the most important legal question in the history of the multi-species world, and there is no consensus on the answer. The lawyers cannot agree. The philosophers cannot agree. The scientists cannot agree. The theologians cannot agree. And the Neanderthals themselves cannot participate in the debate, because the debate is conducted in sapiens' legal language using sapiens, abstract concepts, rights, personhood, citizenship, due process that may be fundamentally inaccessible to their cognitive architecture. The trial is held in a language the defendant cannot speak, about concepts the defendant cannot grasp, and the verdict will determine the defendant's entire future. If that sounds unjust, it is, and it is the foundational injustice of the multi-species legal system, the crack in the foundation that everything else is built on. They are genus Homo. They made art. At La Roche-Cotard cave in France, researchers found 8 panels containing over 400 traces of abstract lines and dots, dating back more than 57,000 years. The cave was sealed by natural processes 6,000 years before sapiens ever arrived in Western Europe, meaning no sapiens' hand could have made those marks. At Bruniquel Cave, 176,500 years ago, Neanderthals broke hundreds of stalagmites and arranged them into 2 large oval ring structures 300 meters underground in total darkness, a feat requiring fire, collective labor, and sustained planning. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, shells painted with red and yellow pigments date to 115,000 years ago. They buried their dead at La Chapelle aux Sins and Shanidar Cave. They cared for their injured Shanidar 1, a Neanderthal with a crushed eye socket, a withered arm and a damaged leg, survived to old age, which proves beyond any reasonable doubt that his community fed him, protected him, and carried him when he could not walk. They did that for years, maybe decades. They did all of this, and yet they may not understand the concept of rights as an abstract sapiens construction, because rights is a metaphor. It is an invisible thing that you believe protects you, even though you cannot hold it or point to it. So the question becomes uncomfortable and unavoidable. Do you need to understand your rights in order to have them? Infants cannot conceptualize rights. Individuals with severe cognitive disabilities cannot conceptualize rights. Both have them. In every legal system on Earth, the precedent exists, but extending it across a species boundary, applying it to beings who think in fundamentally different ways, who may never grasp what you're offering them, that is new territory, and it is terrifying territory for everyone involved. Walk through the centuries in this world. Ancient empires enslaving other species without a second thought, the way they enslaved their own kind. The theological debate, do they have souls? Convulsing every sapiens religion for generations, splitting congregations, sparking heresy trials, rewriting scripture. The Enlightenment arriving with its emphasis on reason as the basis of rights, which explicitly and sometimes deliberately excludes species with different cognitive architecture from the conversation, because if reason is the ticket to personhood, and your species reasons differently, then by definition you are not a person. Then the abolition movement, this world's equivalent of our abolition of racial slavery, the defining moral struggle of age after age, fought and refought and advanced and reversed, marked by violence on both sides, and still incomplete in 2026 the same way racial justice remains incomplete in our own world. The arc bends, but slowly, and some days it bends backward. The legal patchwork in 2026 is exactly that, a patchwork stitched together by compromise and exhaustion. Some species have full legal personhood in progressive sapiens nations. The Scandinavian countries predictably were first, perhaps because they share the longest border with Neanderthal territory and have the most experience living alongside them. Others have what amounts to protected status, which sounds like rights but functions more like endangered species protections than citizenship. Well-intentioned, perhaps, but patronizing in a way that the protected species can feel, even if they cannot articulate why in sapiens' legal language. Island species have territorial sovereignty through treaty, their geography making that possible. Neanderthals in the European hybrid zone have a tangle of different rights depending on which country they stand in. Full personhood in one, protected status in the next, legal ambiguity in the third. The Denisovans, controlling strategic highlands and all that water, negotiated political autonomy early. Their geopolitical leverage forced sapiens to treat them as near equals whether sapiens liked it or not. Water is a powerful negotiating tool. It is difficult to condescend to someone who can turn off your river. The hybrid rights problem is where the system breaks down completely. Consider a specific case. A woman in a Belgian frontier town, her father sapiens, her mother half Neanderthal, making her roughly 1/4 Neanderthal by ancestry. She looks mostly sapiens. She speaks fluent French and serviceable Neanderthal trade Creole. She holds Belgian citizenship. She marries a man from across the border in the Neanderthal-administered zone. He is 3/4 Neanderthal, built like a small tank, with limited fluency in any sapiens language. Their children will be roughly half and half. Which legal system governs this family? Which school do the children attend? Which medical system treats them? Sapiens hospitals designed for sapiens physiology, or Neanderthal clinics designed for Neanderthal bodies? If they divorce, which court has jurisdiction? This is family law, immigration law, and civil rights law colliding simultaneously, and it affects millions of real people living in frontier zones who wake up every day not knowing which set of rules applies to their family. There is a counterintuitive possibility worth considering. Having a genuine biological other might have reduced intrasapiens racism. If the dividing line is species rather than skin colour, then within-species ethnic differences become trivial. An English sapiens and a Nigerian sapien share 100% of their species identity. They look at each other and see a fellow sapiens, someone whose brain works the same way, whose children are fully fertile, whose language is learnable, whose culture is accessible. The multi-species world might be less racist within species, while being far more discriminatory between them. Speciesism replaces racism as the defining bigotry, and the debates sound eerily familiar, just with different nouns in the same ugly sentences. In our world, the Great Ape Project already argues that chimpanzees and gorillas deserve basic rights on the grounds of their cognitive and emotional complexity. Neanderthals, who made art and buried their dead and nursed their wounded through years of disability, present a far stronger case than any living ape. But where do you draw the line? At Naledi, with 500 cubic centimetre brains and possible deliberate burials? At Floresiensis, with 380 cubic centimetre brains and sophisticated stone tools? At Erectus, who mastered fire and crossed oceans but whose interior life we cannot access? The boundary between person and protected animal would be the most contested legal question in the history of jurisprudence, and every society on Earth would answer it differently. Some would draw the line generously and face accusations of granting personhood to creatures who cannot exercise it. Others would draw it narrowly and face accusations of denying souls to beings who clearly possess them. The line itself would move with every election, every court ruling, every viral video of a Naledi child doing something that looks unmistakably like play. We have built this world. Now let us see what happens when you try to live in it, starting with the most intimate question of all. Part 6. Love, Sex, and Families. Across the species line. Her name, or at least the name scientists gave her, is Denny. She is Denisova 11, a first-generation hybrid girl with a Denisovan father and a Neanderthal mother, and her bone fragment was found in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. She lived roughly 90,000 years ago. She's not hypothetical. She's not a thought experiment or a statistical projection. She's real. She's physical proof that two different kinds of human being looked at each other across whatever divide separated them: language, appearance, tribal affiliation, the disapproval of their respective communities, and chose each other anyway, and had a child together. Whatever else was happening in the world around them, territorial tension, language barriers, genetic incompatibility, it did not stop them. Love, or something close enough to love that the distinction does not matter, crossed the species line 90,000 years ago in a cave in the mountains, and the proof is a fragment of bone smaller than your thumb. Modern non-African sapiens carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in every cell of their body. Melanesians and Papuans carry 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA. At least 3 distinct Denisovan populations interbred with modern humans at different times and places across tens of thousands of years. Papers published in December of 2024 in Nature and Science narrowed the main Neanderthal sapiens interbreeding window to 45,000 to 50,000 years ago. In the coexistence scenario, interspecies relationships are not a genetic footnote. They're a permanent and visible feature of daily life, and they are exactly as complicated as you would expect. There is a heartbreak written into the biology that no amount of love can erase. Neanderthal ancestry was specifically selected against on the X chromosome, and in genes expressed in the testes, which strongly suggests reduced male fertility in hybrids. Female hybrids were probably more fertile than males. This means interspecies couples can have children, but their sons may struggle to reproduce. They may be healthy, strong, intelligent in their own way, and still unable to continue the family line. A hybrid boy grows up watching his sisters have children while he cannot. He watches his parents' hope turn to quiet grief. He watches the geneticists run tests and deliver results with careful professional sympathy, explaining the chromosomal incompatibilities in terms that sound clinical but feel like a verdict. Over generations, this creates a pattern that repeats across every hybrid zone on the planet. Interspecies families are possible but genetically fragile. The emotional weight of wanting children with someone whose biology resists the crossing, of loving someone across a line that your own DNA draws and redraws with every generation. That is perhaps the most human story in the multi-species world, regardless of which species is telling it. The pain of it does not require metaphor to understand. It is as concrete as an empty crib. In cosmopolitan cities with mixed populations, interspecies dating is a cultural flashpoint the way interracial dating was in mid-20th century America. Except the biology adds layers our world never had to navigate. Some communities embrace it openly, celebrate it as proof that love transcends every boundary biology can draw. Others criminalize it or enforce social exile on anyone who crosses the line, and the enforcement is not always legal. Sometimes it's a brick through a window, or a whispered campaign that costs someone their job, or a landlord who discovers the nature of the relationship and suddenly finds the apartment is no longer available. Dating applications offer species filters, and the debates about whether those filters are practical tools or instruments of discrimination are as vicious and unresolvable as every other identity debate in the digital age. Parents disown children who cross the line, sometimes permanently, sometimes with a slow cold withdrawal that takes years to become total. Support groups for interspecies couples meet quietly in community centres, comparing notes on families who will not return calls and neighbours who leave unsigned letters, and the particular exhaustion of defending your relationship to strangers who feel entitled to an opinion about it. Hybrid children grow up explaining themselves to everyone, which parent they resemble, which community claims them, which box to check on forms that were not designed for people like them, which mirror to believe on the days when their face looks like two faces superimposed and neither one is quite complete. The identity crisis of the hybrid child is the identity crisis of the frontier zone itself, written on a single face, and there are millions of those faces, and each one tells the same story in a slightly different way. Neanderthal family structure differs fundamentally from the sapiens nuclear model. Genomic evidence shows Neanderthals lived in small, intimate patrilical bands. Females moved between groups based on mitochondrial DNA patterns, but the core group stayed together for life. Family in a Neanderthal context means an extended clan functioning as a single social organism, communal childcare, shared food, absolute interdependence, decisions made by the group rather than the individual. A sapiens who marries into a Neanderthal community does not just marry a person, they join a clan. They give up the sapiens assumption that a couple is a self-contained unit, that a husband and wife and their children are a world unto themselves. In a Neanderthal clan, privacy in the sapien sense barely exists. Your problems are everyone's problems. Your children are everyone's children. Your food is everyone's food. For a sapiens used to independence, this feels suffocating. For a Neanderthal, the sapiens' insistence on nuclear isolation feels abandoning, like watching someone choose loneliness on purpose. The culture shock runs in both directions, and some relationships survive it, and some do not. The ones that do produce families that belong to two worlds and fit perfectly in neither, which is another way of saying they create something new. There is a darker dimension that honesty requires us to address directly. Sapiens' history is saturated with the sexual exoticization of anyone perceived as other. In the multi-species world, this takes on new and ugly forms. Fetishization of Neanderthal physical power, of Denisovan highland features, of floresiensis smallness. This is the interspecies equivalent of racial fetishization, dehumanizing in the most literal sense of the word, and it thrives in the same corners of the internet and the same back alleys of every major city where exploitation has always thrived. The fetishized body is not seen as a person. It is seen as a curiosity, an experience, a story to tell friends. And the person inside that body knows it. The children of hybrid zones number in the millions. They live in frontier regions across Europe and Central Asia, and the question, which species am I, is as central to their identity as ethnicity and nationality are in our world. Hybrid pride movements march through cities with banners in multiple languages and multiple communication systems, spoken words, Neanderthal gestural phrases, Denisovan Highland calls, because hybrid identity is itself a kind of Creole, a new thing made from two old things that is reducible to neither. Hybrid self-hatred festers in quiet rooms, in the mirror, in the moment when you catch someone staring at your brow ridge and you cannot tell if they are curious or disgusted. An entire cultural tradition emerges from the experience of being something the world has no single word for. Novels and songs and films made by hybrids, for hybrids, about the particular loneliness of being between two worlds that each claim half of you and reject the other half. It is complicated and painful, and occasionally beautiful, the way all questions of belonging are, and it is the fastest growing demographic in the multi-species world, which means the future, whatever it looks like, will be shaped increasingly by people who do not fit in the boxes their parents came from. If love can cross species lines, what about God? When 9 species look at the sky, what do they see? Part 7. Religion, Philosophy, and the War Over. What human means. Every major sapiens religion shatters along the same fault line, and the question that breaks them is deceptively simple. Do other species have souls? Catholic theologians debate whether Neanderthals can receive communion, whether the body and blood of Christ are offered to beings who may not understand the concept of sacrifice or salvation. Islamic scholars debate whether Neanderthals are part of the Ummah, the global community of believers, or something outside its boundaries entirely. Hindu philosophers debate whether other species represent different positions in the cycle of reincarnation. Perhaps a Neanderthal life is a particular stage on the wheel, or perhaps reincarnation does not cross species lines at all. Buddhist monks debate whether a Neanderthal consciousness, structured differently from sapiens consciousness, can achieve enlightenment, or whether enlightenment is a concept that only makes sense inside a sapien's brain. Each tradition fractures along this fault line, and the fracturing makes the Reformation look like a minor disagreement about church administration. There is no reconciling the claim that God made man in his image with the existence of 9 different kinds of man, each carrying a different image. Every seminary, every mosque, every monastery must choose, expand the definition, or defend the boundary. Neanderthal spirituality, and there is evidence for something we might cautiously call that, operates on an entirely different basis from sapiens religion. They built those structures in Brunical Cave 176,500 years ago. 2 large oval stalagmite rings, 300 meters underground in absolute darkness, requiring fire and collective labor and sustained planning over what must have been weeks or months of effort. The oldest known well-dated construction by any human species. Think about what that means. Before sapiens had even evolved into our current form, Neanderthals were organizing collective building projects in the most hostile environment imaginable. The interior of a cave system so deep that no natural light has ever reached it. They chose to go there. They chose to build there. They chose a place where the only light was the fire they carried, and they shaped it into something deliberate. They buried their dead at multiple sites across Europe and the Near East. They collected eagle talons, possibly as pendants or ritual objects, and eagle talons are not easy to acquire, which means the talons were worth the risk, which means they meant something. They used red ochre and feathers as body adornment, painting themselves for reasons we can only guess at. Something was happening in those minds that we would recognize as meaningful, even sacred, but without metaphorical thinking, they probably cannot conceive of an invisible God who exists everywhere and nowhere, an afterlife that no one has seen, or sin as an abstract stain on an invisible soul. Their relationship with the sacred is entirely experiential, specific places that carry weight, ritual actions performed together in darkness, reverence for particular animals or features of the natural world that cannot be explained but can be felt. It looks more like animism or Shinto than Abrahamic monotheism. Sapiens missionaries attempt conversion and fail, not because of stubbornness, but because the foundational concepts do not translate. You cannot explain the Trinity to someone whose language lacks the word represents. 9 species of thinking beings demolishes every human-centric philosophy sapiens ever developed. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Which kind of think? Kant's categorical imperative. Does it apply across species lines when the species cannot agree on what a moral principle even means? Utilitarianism asks whether the suffering of one counts equally with the suffering of another. Does a Neanderthal's pain register the same in the calculus as a sapien's pain? And if it does, whose calculus are we using? John Stuart Mill did not design his moral framework for beings who cannot process the concept of the greatest good for the greatest number. A synthesis paper published in November of 2025 pushed back against narratives of Neanderthal cognitive inferiority, demonstrating that they possessed all cognitive abilities on standard behavioral checklists, including flexibility and innovation. The question is not who is smarter. The question is smarter at what, and who gets to define what counts. Because the species doing the defining is always, conveniently, the species that comes out on top of its own ranking system. The phrase different but equal carries ugly freight in our timeline. It was the lie that justified segregation, the legal fiction that allowed separate schools and separate drinking fountains and separate futures, while pretending everyone was being treated fairly. In the multi-species world, the differences are real. Neanderthals genuinely think differently, in ways that have measurable consequences for communication, economic participation, and political representation. They cannot vote on legislation they cannot conceptualize. They cannot sign contracts they cannot abstract. They cannot worship in churches built around metaphors they cannot process. Can a society recognize genuine cognitive difference without building a hierarchy? Can you acknowledge that two minds work differently without someone concluding that one works better? That one is the real mind and the other is a faulty copy? Can you build a political system that grants equal dignity to beings who cannot participate equally in the system's own mechanisms? There is no easy answer. There may be no answer at all that everyone accepts. But the question itself is the most important philosophical contribution the multi-species world makes. Because our world asks it too, about disability, about neurodivergence, about cognitive decline in aging, and we have never come close to resolving it either. Art might be the bridge that nothing else can build. If language and theology divide, creative expression might unite. Neanderthals created abstract marks more than 57,000 years ago. A 2025 cognitive archaeology paper argues they possess the necessary cognitive abilities for creating and interpreting visual art. Each species develops unique aesthetic traditions, 9 perceptual systems, 9 ways of seeing beauty, 9 artistic vocabularies that do not require metaphorical language to be understood. Visual art, music, dance, and physical craftsmanship become the common ground, the one place where all 9 traditions can meet, because a beautiful thing does not need to be explained to be felt. A Neanderthal carving does not need a sapien's caption. A Denisovan mountain song does not need a translator. A Naledi drum rhythm played in the dark needs nothing but ears and a willingness to listen. Art becomes the interspecies language that words cannot be, and the galleries and concert halls of the multi-species world are the closest thing it has to a church that everyone can enter. This does not solve the philosophical crisis. Nothing solves it. That is the point. But it offers something that philosophy alone cannot, a shared experience of wonder that does not depend on shared cognition. Two species that cannot agree on the nature of justice or the existence of God can stand in front of the same painting and both feel something. They may feel different things. They almost certainly do. A sapien sees symbolism and narrative. A Neanderthal sees colour and form and spatial relationship with an acuity the sapiens cannot match. But the feeling itself, the pause, the attention, the moment of being moved by something made by another mind, that is the thread that holds the whole fraying tapestry together. It is not enough to build a political system on. It is not enough to resolve the rights crisis or the economic divide or the theological fractures. But it is enough to remind everyone, on both sides of every species line, that the mind on the other side is a mind. Different, yes, alien in some ways, but a mind nonetheless capable of making something beautiful and recognizing beauty when it sees it. That recognition is the beginning of everything. Without it, there is nothing to negotiate. With it, there is at least a starting point. Philosophy is fine in peacetime, but for 300,000 years, these species were not debating. They were fighting. Part 8. Warfare, Territory, and the Long History of Interspecies Conflict. Before sapiens developed projectile weapons, interspecies warfare was intimate and brutal, the kind of violence that happens close enough to smell your enemy's breath. Raiding parties crossing frozen rivers at dawn, territorial skirmishes at the tree line where the boreal forest meets the temperate lowlands, ambushes in mountain passes where one side knows every rock and shadow and the other does not. This was not the organised warfare of empires. There were no empires yet, no supply chains, no grand strategy. This was the warfare of neighbours who have lived too close for too long, and it was personal in a way that modern warfare never is. Neanderthals wielded close-range thrusting spears. At Schöningen in Germany, 300,000-year-old wooden throwing spears have been found preserved in waterlogged soil, the oldest known hunting weapons on Earth, perfectly balanced, hardened by fire, made by hands that understood wood the way a surgeon understands a scalpel. Sapiens eventually developed atlatls and then bows and arrows, which changed the geometry of killing entirely. The physics of these encounters favoured different outcomes at different ranges. Inside 10 metres, you did not want to face a Neanderthal, a barrel-chested body with bone density far exceeding yours, wielding a heavy-tipped spear with arms built for close-quarters thrusting. That is a fight you lose, every time, no matter how brave you are or how well you have trained. Neanderthal skeletal remains consistently show patterns of injury similar to rodeo riders, broken ribs, fractured skulls, healed limb fractures, suggesting a life spent in violent close contact with large dangerous animals and occasionally with each other. They were built for contact. You were not. Beyond 30 metres, the sapiens with a bow had every advantage, because projectile weapons do not care how strong you are. An arrow does not negotiate. An arrow does not wrestle. An arrow arrives before the target knows it has been launched. The frontier between sapiens' temperate zones and Neanderthal boreal zones became a 100,000-year war zone, punctuated by trade, interbreeding, and fragile truces, often all three happening simultaneously in the same generation, sometimes in the same family, because war and love have always been neighbours. The technology escalation changed everything, the way it always does in the story of warfare. Sapiens invented sewing needles, which sounds trivial until you realise that tailored clothing allowed them to invade cold environments that had previously been Neanderthal-only territory. Neanderthals used drape-style clothing, animal hides wrapped and tied around the body. Sapiens sewed fitted garments with hoods and sleeves and insulated layers. In a Scandinavian winter, the difference between those two approaches is the difference between mobility and hypothermia, between an army that can march and one that freezes in the field. Sapiens invented boats, which meant they could reach Floresiensis islands that water had protected for hundreds of thousands of years. They invented metallurgy, bronze, then iron, then steel, gunpowder, industrial warfare. Each technological leap widened the gap between what sapiens could project and what any other species could resist. But environment-specific advantages never fully disappeared. Neanderthals in winter warfare on home terrain remained deadly. Denisovans at altitude, where sapiens' lungs burn and judgment falters from oxygen, deprivation, held an advantage no technology could erase. Floresiensis guerrilla fighters in island jungle so thick that larger-bodied soldiers could not move through it without cutting every step. That is a war of attrition the invader always loses. The colonial era is where the story turns darkest, and the parallels to our own history are almost too precise. Portuguese ships reaching Floresiensis Islands in the 1500s, and the sailors' first reports describing small wild men, the way they described every indigenous people they encountered, as curiosities first, as obstacles second, as resources third. British colonists pushing into Neanderthal-held Scotland and the Northern Highlands, where the clearances that displaced human clans in our timeline would have displaced an entirely different species in this one. Russian expansion into Siberian territories where Neanderthals and Denisovans had lived for millennia, before any sapiens set foot there, driven by the same hunger for fur and timber and mineral wealth that drove it in our world, but with the added cruelty that the people being displaced were visibly, undeniably different from the people displacing them. Every atrocity from our colonial timeline, slavery, forced labour, deliberate starvation, cultural destruction, children taken from families and placed in sapiens boarding schools to be civilized, replicated across species lines. with the additional horror that the colonizers genuinely believe the colonized are a biologically different and inferior kind of being. They do not have to invent the justification. They believe they can see it in the shape of a skull, in the width of a brow, in the slowness of speech. Disease was especially devastating. Sapiens evolved in Africa, which is pathogen-dense, and their immune systems reflect that long arms race with malaria, typhoid, and 1,000 other tropical killers. When they migrated into Eurasia, they carried pathogens that devastated Neanderthal populations with no resistance, the same pattern that destroyed Native American populations when Europeans arrived carrying smallpox and measles. Some researchers estimate that disease alone could have reduced Neanderthal populations by half before any direct conflict occurred. Biology is the cruelest weapon because no one has to aim it, and no one has to take responsibility for where it lands. The modern military situation in 2026 is this: the age of open territorial conquest is mostly over. International treaties protect species territories the way environmental treaties protect endangered habitats, imperfectly, inconsistently, and only when the nations signing the treaties find it politically convenient to honour them. Enforcement depends on political will, and political will depends on public opinion, and public opinion depends on whether the species being threatened looks enough like us to generate sympathy on the evening news. Tensions remain everywhere. Sapiens nations eye mineral resources beneath Neanderthal-held ground, lithium deposits, rare earths, the raw materials of the 21st century economy sitting under forests that international law says belong to someone else. Chinese development projects press against Denisovan autonomy with the slow patience of a government that thinks in centuries. Indonesian logging interests creep toward Floresiensis Islands, one permit at a time, one forest concession at a time, each one legal, each one small, and the cumulative effect is a noose tightening so slowly that no single loop triggers the alarm. Modern conflicts look less like invasion and more like indigenous land rights struggles, slow, legal, economic, and deeply bitter, fought in courtrooms where one side may not fully understand the proceedings and the other side is counting on exactly that. The most frightening scenario is a sapiens nation deciding that a non-sapiens territory contains resources worth taking, and the international community choosing not to intervene because enough sapiens, in enough positions of power, quietly do not consider the inhabitants to be really human. We know this can happen. We have watched it happen in our own timeline, between members of our own species, over differences that are cosmetic compared to the differences between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. The question of nuclear deterrence hangs over all of it. Do non-sapiens territories have nuclear weapons? Almost certainly not. Nuclear physics requires the kind of abstract reasoning that sapiens monopolize. But if Denisovan territory is incorporated into a sapiens alliance system, they might shelter under a nuclear umbrella. If not, their sovereignty depends entirely on geography, treaty enforcement, and the good faith of nations that have historically shown very little good faith when resources are at stake. The most dangerous moment in the multi-species world would not be a war. It would be a meeting in a sapiens capital where someone says, "They are not really like us," and the room nods. That is the darkness. Now let us take a breath, because nothing reveals a society quite like what it does for fun. Part 9. Sports, Entertainment, and Celebrity in a Multi-Species Culture. The Olympic question divides the planet every 4 years, and it never gets resolved. Do you integrate, or do you segregate? Neanderthals dominate sprint events, weightlifting, wrestling, shot put, and any sport that rewards explosive power and a low centre of gravity. Males standing 5'4" with barrel chests and legs built like hydraulic presses, carrying muscle fibres that produce more force per square centimetre than anything in a sapiens body. But those same proportions that make them unstoppable in a 100-metre dash make them poor distance runners and mediocre swimmers. Their bodies burn hot and fast, built for ambush predation, not marathon endurance. Sapiens dominate endurance sports, basketball, high jump, and anything requiring tactical abstraction over long periods, the chess match within the physical contest, the strategic patience that wins a tennis rally or a fencing bout. Floresiensis at 3 feet 7 inches cannot compete in most sapiens sports at all, but their hand-eye coordination and fine motor precision might be extraordinary in archery, darts, shooting, or table tennis. Do you run 1 Olympics? Do you run 9? Do you run separate events and watch the audience only care about the Sapiens ones, the way viewership drops when the cameras leave the marquee sports? Do you create weight classes based on species, the way boxing creates them based on body mass? There is no fair answer. There may not even be an unfair answer that everyone can agree on. The Olympic Committee in the multi-species world is the most controversial organisation on Earth, and every 4 years it proves it. The first Neanderthal to compete in a Sapiens professional league would be as culturally significant as Jackie Robinson, breaking the colour barrier in American baseball. Imagine a Neanderthal heavyweight boxer, barrel-chested, with wrists thicker than your ankles and a punch backed by bone density that makes Sapiens' skeletal structure look like balsa wood by comparison. Imagine the hatred that would greet him, the death threats scrawled on locker room walls, the referees watching for any excuse to disqualify, the commentators who cannot quite bring themselves to call him an athlete, who always find a way to qualify their praise, impressive for his kind, the opposing fighters who refuse to shake hands, and then imagine the slow, grudging, inevitable acceptance as the crowds discover they care more about the fight than about the fighter's species, that entertainment has a way of eroding prejudice that legislation cannot match, because legislation changes rules but entertainment changes feelings. The sports pages become the front pages. They always do, they always have, and the first Neanderthal athlete to become a household name would do more for interspecies relations than a century of political negotiation, because you cannot hate someone you are cheering for, and you cannot cheer for someone without recognizing, at some level you might not want to admit, that they are a person. Film, music, and television split along cognitive lines in ways that surprise everyone. Sapiens dominate narrative entertainment, movies, novels, serialized television, podcasts, because narrative requires metaphorical language and abstract storytelling, the ability to say, this character represents something larger than themselves. A sapient screenwriter can construct a story where a journey across a desert is really about grief, where a locked door is really about fear, where a rising tide is really about social change. These layered meanings are invisible to audiences that cannot process metaphor, which means most Sapiens entertainment is literally incomprehensible to most non-Sapiens viewers. They see the desert but not the grief, the door but not the fear. But Neanderthals, with their superior visual processing, those larger occipital lobes working overtime, might dominate visual arts, spatial design, and musical composition in ways no Sapiens brain can replicate. Imagine a film score written by someone who processes sound and image simultaneously at a resolution you cannot achieve, who hears harmonics your ears miss, and sees colour relationships your optic nerve was not built for. A Neanderthal composer does not write music the way a Sapiens composer does. There is no narrative arc, no programmatic meaning, no metaphor embedded in the melody. Instead, there is something closer to pure architecture in sound, structures of rhythm and tone that satisfy the ear the way a well-built wall satisfies the hand, and Sapiens listeners find themselves moved by it without being able to explain why, which may be the purest form of artistic communication there is. Imagine Denisovan documentary crews filming at altitudes where Sapiens camera operators need oxygen tanks to stand up, capturing footage of landscapes that no Sapiens camera crew could reach and survive long enough to shoot. Imagine Floresiensis puppet theatre on miniature stages in jungle clearings, telling stories through movement and colour that predate Sapiens' arrival on their islands by hundreds of thousands of years. Stories whose plots a Sapiens audience cannot follow, but whose visual beauty stops them in their tracks. Imagine Naledi performance art experienced entirely through sound and touch in pitch-black underground chambers, where the absence of light is not a limitation but the medium itself, and sighted species emerge from the performance shaken by what they felt in the dark, unable to describe the experience in visual terms, because visual terms are the wrong language for something that was never meant to be seen. Social media fractures along species lines the way it fractures along cultural lines in our world, except here the fractures run all the way down to neurology. Short-form video platforms optimized for Sapiens, rapid narrative clips, text overlays, abstract humour that requires knowing what a metaphor is to get the joke. A Neanderthal equivalent focused on high-resolution visual content with minimal text, where the beauty of an image matters more than the caption beneath it. And the most popular accounts post nothing but slow, exquisitely detailed videos of landscapes and craftsmanship and animal behaviour that Sapiens users find mesmerising, even if they cannot articulate why. Interspecies meme culture sometimes bridges the gap and sometimes widens it. Viral moments of cross-species friendship rack up billions of views, a Neanderthal child and a sapiens child sharing food in a schoolyard, a Denisovan grandmother teaching a sapiens tourist to sing a Highland melody. Viral moments of cross-species conflict rack up billions more. The algorithm does not care about species. It cares about engagement, and engagement feeds on both love and anger equally, which means the platforms that were supposed to connect the multi-species world end up amplifying its worst instincts as often as its best ones. Cultural appropriation debates multiply by 9. Sapiens wearing Neanderthal-style jewellery as a fashion trend in Milan. Sapiens restaurants serving authentic Erectus cuisine to tourists who have never met an Erectus and could not pronounce their word for the dish being served to them. Sapiens musicians sampling Denisovan Highland singing without credit, compensation, or understanding of what the song meant to the people who created it. Every argument our world has ever had about who owns a cultural practice, who gets to borrow it, and who is just extracting profit from it, that argument played across 9 species lines, with the added dimension that a species which cannot fully articulate its own traditions in sapiens language may not even be able to participate in the debate about its own culture on sapiens terms. The committees are all sapiens. The copyright law is all sapiens. The concept of intellectual property is a sapiens abstraction that several species cannot grasp, and yet the thing being appropriated, the song, the pattern, the ritual, belongs to them in every sense that matters. But here is the twist nobody sees coming. The species we spent millennia trying to conquer are the reason the planet is still livable. Part 10. The environment. The planet that never burned. This is the argument that ties everything together, and it begins with a number. 3 to 4 billion instead of 8 billion. Sapiens' explosion to 8 billion people in our timeline is a direct consequence of what researchers call self-domestication. Duke University researcher Brian Hare proposed the survival of the friendliest hypothesis. Natural selection favoured increased prosociality in sapiens, tolerance for crowding, ability to cooperate with complete strangers, networking behaviour that scales to millions. This produced a domestication syndrome, reduced brow ridges, smaller teeth, more juvenile facial features, reduced reactive aggression, the same pattern observed in Belyaev's famous silver fox experiment, where selecting for tameness in foxes produced dramatic physical changes within just a few generations. This self-domestication is what allows you to live in a city, work in an office with people you have never met, and stand in a subway car pressed against strangers without losing your mind. It is the psychological infrastructure of civilization itself. No other human species shares these traits to the same degree. Neanderthals lived in intimate bands where everyone knew everyone, maybe 15 to 25 individuals who had known each other since birth, and they did not tolerate outsiders easily. A stranger approaching a Neanderthal camp was not greeted with curiosity. A stranger was a threat until proven otherwise, and the proving took a long time. Their social world was small and intense, and fiercely loyal within its boundaries and fiercely hostile beyond them. You cannot build a city with people who do not tolerate strangers. You cannot run a factory with people who only trust their own kin. You cannot create a global economy with people whose social horizon ends at the tree line. In a world where Neanderthals hold the boreal forests, Denisovans hold the highlands, Erectus and Floresiensis hold the tropics and islands, sapiens still build cities, but they cannot expand without limit. Total human population across all species in 2026, maybe 3 to 4 billion, half of our world's total. The Anthropocene is muted. The carbon footprint is lighter. The planet breathes in ways it has forgotten how to breathe in our timeline. Mammoths roam Siberian Neanderthal territory, actual living mammoths, shaggy and immense and utterly real, because Neanderthals coexisted with megafauna for 400,000 years without hunting them to extinction. Their small, isolated populations could not generate the coordinated hunting pressure that sapiens networks enabled. When sapiens hunt, they network, coordinating across bands, sharing information about migration routes, organising drives that push entire herds off cliffs or into river crossings, where they can be slaughtered in mass. The archaeological record of sapiens hunting is a record of industrial efficiency applied to wildlife. Kill sites with the bones of dozens of animals, processing stations where meat was dried for transport, trade networks that moved mammoth ivory thousands of kilometres from where the animal fell. When Neanderthals hunt, they hunt in small groups, targeting individual animals with close-range weapons, taking what they need and no more, because there is no trade network to feed, no surplus economy to supply, no distant market demanding mammoth products. The difference in ecological impact is the difference between a scalpel and a chainsaw. Professor Penny Spickins of the University of York has argued that if Neanderthals had prevailed, their populations and lifestyles would have meant far less environmental destruction. In the multi-species world, the Pleistocene megafauna extinction simply does not happen the way it did in ours. Woolly rhinoceroses persist in the Eurasian highlands. Cave bears hibernate in mountains that nobody turned into ski resorts. Giant ground sloths may still lumber through South American forests if sapiens' colonization of the Americas was slowed by competition from species that arrived before them. The world that lost its megafauna in our timeline never lost them in this one, and the cascading ecological consequences of that single difference are almost impossible to overstate, because megafauna shape entire ecosystems through their grazing, their movement, their dung, their deaths. The Industrial Revolution still happens, sapiens still invent steam engines, factories, and fossil fuel extraction, but at half the scale, half the speed, and half the environmental impact. Researcher Ludovic Slimak has argued that Neanderthals would never have adopted industrialization. Their way of life, built on small groups and intimate environmental knowledge and minimal networking between distant communities, was fundamentally incompatible with the absolute standardization that industrial production requires. Industry needs interchangeable parts, interchangeable workers, and interchangeable consumers. Neanderthals are none of those things. They do not block industrialization. They simply do not participate, and the resources in their territory, the timber, the coal seams, the iron ore beneath Neanderthal-held forests, remain largely untouched. By 2026, climate change exists in the multi-species world. Sapiens still burn fossil fuels, still fly airplanes, but it is a 1-degree problem, not a 2-degree emergency. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between inconvenience and catastrophe, and that difference is measured in the territories that industrialization never reached, because someone else was already living there. The oceans tell the same story. Sapiens overfishing is constrained because many coastal zones and island waters are held or contested by Erectus and Florescensis communities who fish sustainably. Coral reefs are healthier because fewer trawlers drag their nets across them. Fish stocks are higher because the demand is lower. Plastic pollution is dramatically reduced because fewer sapiens means less plastic produced, less consumed, less discarded. The oceans of the multi-species world in 2026 look roughly like our oceans looked in 1950, which is to say they look like oceans that are still alive. And here is the part that should stop you cold. This is the thesis of everything you have heard tonight. The species that sapiens spent millennia trying to conquer, displace, and exploit are the reason the planet is still livable. Neanderthal backwardness, their refusal to industrialize, their small populations, their conservative use of resources, turns out to be the Earth's immune system. The multi-species world is accidentally sustainable because the one species capable of burning the planet to the ground was never given sole control of the match. The sapiens' impulse to grow, to expand, to network, to scale, to consume, the same impulse that built cathedrals and mapped genomes and put footprints on the moon, that impulse, unchecked by competing species, produced the climate crisis, the 6th mass extinction, the plastic-choked oceans and the stripped forests of our actual world. The species we called primitive were running the life support system the entire time. They did not know they were doing it. They were just living their lives, in their territories, the way they always had. And that was enough. The bitter irony is that you cannot get this world back. You cannot undo the extinctions and restore the balance. The Neanderthals are gone. The Denisovans are gone. The hobbits are gone. Every species that might have held the line against sapiens' expansion has been removed from the equation, and the math that follows is the math of our actual present, 8 billion and climbing, with carbon dioxide concentrations that would not exist if the boreal forests still had their guardians. The multi-species world is not a plan, it is a mirror held up to show us what we lost when we found ourselves alone on a planet that was never meant for just one kind of mind. That is the world that could have been. Now let us return to the real one. Because in the last few months, actual scientific discoveries have changed everything we thought we knew about the species we lost. Part 11, Littlefoot's face reveals the common ancestor. On March 2nd, 2026, a team led by Dr. Amélie Baudet an honorary researcher at Wits University in South Africa, based at CNRS and the Université de Poitiers in France, published a paper in the journal Comptes rendus par les vols that quietly rewrote the opening chapter of the human story. Most people missed it. They should not have. The team used a synchrotron, a type of particle accelerator that generates X-rays of extraordinary precision, far beyond what any hospital scanner or university laboratory can produce, at the Diamond Light Source facility in Oxfordshire, England, specifically the I-12 beamline. The synchrotron accelerates electrons to nearly the speed of light, and when those electrons change direction, they release X-rays of such intensity and focus that they can penetrate rock without destroying the fossil inside it. Their subject was a skull that had waited 3.67 million years to be understood. Littlefoot is the name given to an Australopithecus skeleton discovered in 1994 at Sterkfontein Caves, 40 kilometres northwest of Johannesburg. She's the most complete early hominin skeleton ever found, more than 90% intact, a degree of preservation that borders on miraculous for something that old. But her skull had been so crushed and distorted by millions of years of geological pressure, rock slowly pressing bone out of shape, fragment by fragment, millimetre by millimetre, the weight of the earth itself slowly destroying the record it was trying to preserve, that physical reconstruction was impossible. The face of one of our oldest known ancestors was, until this study, unreadable. A puzzle with all the pieces present but none of them in the right place. The team captured over 9,000 high-resolution images of the skull fragments, generating terabytes of data that were processed by a University of Cambridge supercomputer. The result was a three-dimensional digital reconstruction at 21 micron resolution, fine enough to see details invisible to the naked eye, fine enough to distinguish individual bone surfaces that had been crushed together for longer than any human species has existed. When they digitally realigned the fragments, painstakingly reversing the damage that 3.67 million years of pressure had inflicted, moving each piece back to where geometry and anatomy said it should be, like solving a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle where every piece has been warped by the weight of a continent, the face that emerged told an unexpected story. Littlefoot had proportionally large orbits, eye sockets, sized somewhere between those of a gorilla and an orangutan, large eyes in other words, eyes built to gather more light, to see more detail, to process more visual information than a modern human's eyes can manage. This was not what anyone predicted for a South African specimen, and the overall facial structure was closer to East African Australopithecus specimens than to other South African ones, which meant that the clean geographic division that paleoanthropologists had drawn between East African and South African populations was wrong. Professor Dominic Stratford of Wits University explained that rather than viewing early hominin evolution as something that happened in isolated pockets of Africa, the study supports the idea of the entire continent functioning as a connected evolutionary system, with populations moving and mixing and sharing genes across thousands of kilometres, the way populations always do when they can walk. Those large orbits are not a trivial anatomical detail. A previous study had already shown that Littlefoot had a more developed visual cortex than modern humans possess, more neurons dedicated to processing what the eyes take in, more brain real estate devoted to seeing the world in higher resolution and finer detail. This foreshadows one of the key themes that has run through this entire story, the visual processing advantage that Neanderthals possess, their larger occipital lobes, their superior visual acuity. These are not Neanderthal innovations, they are ancestral traits that sapiens lost somewhere along the way. The common ancestor could see better than you can. When you sit in a dark theatre and a Neanderthal next to you notices details in the shadows that you miss entirely, the flicker of movement at the edge of the screen, the subtle colour shift that signals a change in lighting, that is not their upgrade. It is your downgrade. Somewhere in the last few 100,000 years, your lineage traded raw visual power for the neural connectivity that produces metaphor. The wiring that lets you say time is money came at the cost of the wiring that lets you see a predator in the shadows at 50 metres in twilight. Whether that was a good deal depends entirely on who you ask, and neither answer is wrong. Evolution does not optimise toward a single perfect form, it trades. Everything gained is something else surrendered, and the ledger never balances the way we want it to. Every species on this planet is a record of what was kept and what was given up, and no species kept everything. Littlefoot is the shared starting point. 3.67 million years ago, the lineage that would eventually produce sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Erectus, Floresiensis, Naledi, and every other human species, was one population of small-brained, tree-climbing bipeds walking upright across Africa. They were not impressive by modern standards, small bodies, small brains, no tools that we have found, no fire, no language as we would recognize it. But they were already doing the thing that would define every species that descended from them. They were moving, they were exploring, they were spreading across a continent, finding new food sources, adapting to new conditions, and crucially, mixing with each other as they went. The fact that Littlefoot's face connects East and South African populations tells us that our earliest ancestors were already a mobile, interbreeding, continent-spanning population. The same pattern we see in the multi-species world's hybrid zones today. The family tree does not start with the genus Homo. It starts here, with a 3-foot-tall ancestor whose crushed face required a particle accelerator and 3.67 million years of patience to read. There is ongoing debate about what to call her: Australopithecus prometheus, Australopithecus africanus, or possibly something else entirely, because even at 3.67 million years old, the question of what constitutes a species is already tangled beyond easy resolution. Dr. Zeray Alem-Seged of the University of Chicago noted that this complexity shows how tangled the patterns of variation are in the genus Australopithecus, and how close that genus sits to the great apes. The taxonomic messiness is not a failure of science, it is a reflection of reality. Species boundaries are fuzzier than we like to believe, fuzzier than our classification systems can comfortably handle, fuzzier than the neat diagrams in textbooks suggest. We draw hard lines because hard lines are easy to think with. Nature draws gradients, and the gradient that connects Littlefoot to you, through 3.67 million years of branching, splitting, recombining, diverging, and occasionally reuniting, is the same gradient that connects every species in the multi-species world to every other. We are all variations on a theme composed by a 3-foot-tall biped who walked upright across Africa when the world was young, and the future held room for everyone. The fact that we argue about her name only proves how much we need categories, and how poorly categories serve us when the thing being categorized is life itself. That was 3.67 million years ago. But the fate of the hobbits was decided much more recently, by rain. Part 12, The Flora's Drought, the coin flip that killed the hobbits. On December 8, 2025, a study published in Communications, Earth and Environment told us exactly how a species that had survived for 700,000 years was erased by weather. Not by war, not by competition, by rain that stopped falling. The team was led by Mike Gagan, with Linda Aliff, Mika Puspaningrum, Gerrit van den Berg, Nick Scroxton, and an international group of researchers from the University of Wollongong and Indonesian institutions. They wanted to reconstruct the climate of Flores during the window when Homo floresiensis disappeared from the fossil record, and they used 2 independent lines of evidence to do it. First, chemical records from cave stalagmites in nearby Lianglua Cave, specifically magnesium to calcium ratios, which track local rainfall with remarkable precision. When more rain falls, the chemistry of the water dripping through limestone changes, and the stalagmite records that change like a diary written in mineral ink. Second, they extracted oxygen isotope data from the fossil teeth of Stegodon florensis insularis, the pygmy elephant that the hobbits hunted. By combining these 2 records, they could distinguish between annual, summer and winter, rainfall patterns going back tens of thousands of years, and build a climate history of the island in seasonal detail. The picture that emerged was devastating in its clarity. An extensive drying trend began around 76,000 years ago, reducing mean annual rainfall by 37%. This was not a sudden catastrophe, not a volcano, or an earthquake or a flood. It was a slow strangulation, generation after generation experiencing slightly less rain than the one before, watching rivers narrow year by year, watching forest thin tree by tree, watching the world shrink in a way so gradual that no single generation could have recognized what was happening. The trend culminated in severe summer drought between 61,000 and 55,000 years ago, when summer rainfall dropped to roughly half of modern levels. Rivers that had run year-round for millennia became seasonal trickles and then bare stone. Waterholes that had sustained communities for thousands of years turned to dust. The Stegodon population, the hobbits' primary food source, specifically juvenile pygmy elephants identified by cut marks on bones found in Liangbua Cave, collapsed sharply around 61,000 years ago. These pygmy elephants, themselves an island-adapted species standing barely a metre tall at the shoulder, depended on the same water and the same vegetation that the drought was destroying. When the elephants went, the hobbits' food web unravelled. When your food disappears and your water goes seasonal, you do not need an invading army to destroy you. The island does it for you, slowly, implacably, without malice or intention. A volcanic eruption approximately 50,000 years ago compounded the devastation. Professor Gagan described how the ecosystem around Liangbua became dramatically drier, exactly when Floresiensis vanished, with summer rainfall falling to about half of modern levels and riverbed water sources going dry for months at a time. Homo sapiens arrived at Liangbua approximately 46,000 years ago. The hobbits were already gone. This is the single most important finding in the study. They did not lose to us. They lost to rain. Paleoclimatologist Nick Scroxton of Maynooth University stated that the climate almost certainly played a major role, and the data supports that understatement with overwhelming force. This changes the hypothetical scenario entirely. Remove the drought, make it shorter by 5,000 years, shift the rainfall pattern slightly, let one more monsoon season arrive on time, and the hobbits hold their island. They survive into the era of written records. They are encountered by Portuguese sailors in the 1500s instead of by Australian archaeologists in 2003. Imagine the moment. A ship's lookout spots movement on the beach, small figures, impossibly small, carrying stone tools, watching the ship with an intelligence that is unmistakable even from a distance. The sailors row ashore. The hobbits do not run. They have never seen a sapiens before, but they have survived alongside Komodo dragons for 700,000 years. They do not frighten easily. The encounter rewrites every assumption Europe has about what it means to be human. The hobbits become the most scientifically revolutionary species alive, because they prove that a chimpanzee-sized brain of roughly 380 cubic centimetres, given 700,000 years of unbroken cultural evolution, can produce stone tools, organised hunting, fire use, and survival strategies complex enough to outlast predators that stood taller than they did and weighed 50 times more. Local legends on Flores speak of the Ebu Gogo, small, hairy, cave-dwelling humans, which may represent folk memory of actual encounters with Floresiensis that happened closer to the present than the fossil record currently admits. Some versions of the stories describe these small people stealing food from village gardens, running with a strange bow-legged gait, and speaking in a rapid language that sounded like chattering to sapiens' ears. The details are too specific, too consistent across different villages on different parts of the island to dismiss as pure invention. An old woman in one village describes the same creature that an old man in a village 50 kilometres away describes, and neither has ever met the other, and the stories have been passed down for generations. Perhaps some Floresiensis populations survived longer in remote valleys and highland caves that have not yet been excavated. Flores is a rugged island, and its interior has barely been surveyed by archaeologists. Perhaps the overlap between hobbits and sapiens was real, and lasted long enough to become story, and the stories are not legends at all but history wearing the only disguise that pre-literate cultures have. The voice of a grandmother telling her grandchildren what she saw when she was young, or what her grandmother told her, in a chain of memory that stretches back to the last days of a species that should still be here. This is not abstract evolutionary theory. This was a species of people, 3 feet 7 inches tall, making their own tools, hunting animals that dwarfed them, sharing their island with predators that could have swallowed them whole, and persisting through 700 millennia of volcanism, sea level change, and competition with every other creature on an island that wanted to eat them. Erased by a drought they could not predict, could not prevent, and could not outlast. One weather pattern, lasting a few thousand years, on one island decided whether a 700,000-year-old species would exist today or vanish into stone. Think about that the next time someone tells you that survival of the fittest means the best always win. The hobbits were fit for everything their island could throw at them, everything except a drought that no species on Earth could have anticipated or survived. They did not fail. The rain failed them. And the silence that followed lasted 60,000 years, until an Australian archaeologist named Mike Morwood found their bones in 2003 and gave them back to a world that had forgotten they ever existed. In a world where we discuss climate change every single day, the hobbits are a reminder that weather does not just reshape environments, it erases entire kinds of human being, quietly, completely, and without appeal. The drought did not know it was killing a species, the rain did not know it had stopped, the island did not mourn, only we mourn, 70,000 years later, holding a bone fragment in a laboratory, and understanding for the first time what the silence on Flores actually cost. So related species can share a world. We know this because 95 million years ago, two cousins proved it in spectacular fashion. Part 13, Spinosaurus mirabilis. Proof that related species share a world. On February 19, 2026, a study published in the journal Science described a creature that should not have surprised anyone who understood evolution. But it did, because what we think we know, and what we actually know, are rarely the same thing. The team was led by Paul Sereno of the University of Chicago, with 20 co-authors from institutions around the world. They had been working in remote Saharan Niger at a fossil site called Jengabi since 2019. The Sahara is not kind to field teams. Temperatures that can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, sand that infiltrates every piece of equipment, and a remoteness that means any medical emergency is days from the nearest hospital. That first year they discovered some unusual bony crests, but did not fully recognize what they were looking at. The fragments were too incomplete, the context too unclear, and in paleontology, the difference between a new species and a fragment of a known one can be a single bone seen from the right angle. They returned in 2022 with a larger team and better equipment, and found additional specimens from at least 3 individuals of the same species, along with a menagerie of other creatures sharing the same ancient ecosystem, Carcharodontosaurus, 2 species of sauropod dinosaur, crocodiles, turtles, and a freshwater fish 12 feet long that would have been the apex predator of any river it inhabited until a Spinosaur showed up. When they finally assembled the puzzle pieces across years of preparation, meticulous comparison and peer review, they were looking at the first new species of Spinosaurus described in over 100 years, since Spinosaurus aegyptiacus was named by the German paleontologist Ernst Stromer in 1915. They called it Spinosaurus mirabilis, meaning astonishing Spinosaurus, and the name was earned. It was the length of a school bus and weighed several tons. It carried a massive scimitar-shaped cranial crest atop its skull, sheathed in keratin like the casque on a modern cassowary, probably brightly coloured in life, reds, oranges, blues, whatever palette evolution painted it with to make it visible from the greatest possible distance. You have to understand what a crest like this means in evolutionary terms. It is not a weapon, it is not a tool, it is a billboard. Paul Sereno noted it would have been a very bad weapon, awkwardly positioned on the skull, fragile in structure, and asymmetrical in a way that makes no sense for a battering implement, but perfect sense as a signal saying, I am this species, I am this sex, I am this individual, look at me and know exactly what you are dealing with. The animal had a long, narrow snout built for snaring fish with precision rather than brute force, a neck adapted for stabbing downward into water with heron-like efficiency, and legs long enough to wade in river shallows without submerging its body. Sereno compared them directly to herons, suspecting the animal fished largely in water about 3 feet in depth, standing perfectly still, watching the surface with predatory patience, then striking downward with explosive force when a shadow moved beneath the water. The detail that matters most for our story is geography. Previous Spinosaur fossils were almost exclusively found in coastal deposits near ancient shorelines, beaches, tidal flats, estuaries. These were animals associated with the sea, or at least with the narrow boundary where land and ocean meet. Spinosaurus mirabilis was found 500 to 1,000 kilometers from the nearest ancient marine shoreline. This was not a coastal animal at all. This animal lived in a forested inland habitat dissected by freshwater rivers, hunting fish in water that had never tasted salt, a completely different ecological niche from its coastal relative Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. Even though both were massive fish-eating predators of the same genus, living on the same continent at the same time, Steve Brussati of the University of Edinburgh described the crest with his characteristic flair, comparing it to the flamboyant quiff hairstyle of Elvis Presley. Different crests for different audiences, different habitats for different lifestyles, different prey strategies for different waterways, but clearly the same genus, sharing the same landmass, coexisting in the late Cretaceous roughly 95 million years ago without one driving the other to extinction. They solved the problem of being related by being different, and the solution lasted millions of years. This is a 95-million-year-old proof of concept for everything we have discussed tonight. Closely related species of the same genus can coexist by occupying different ecological niches, the same way two restaurants on the same street can both survive if one serves breakfast and the other serves dinner. One Spinosaur stays coastal, fishing the tidal flats and estuaries where rivers meet the ancient Tethys Sea. One moves hundreds of kilometers inland, fishing freshwater rivers that have never seen saltwater. Different display structures, different crests, different colors, different shapes visible from a distance, signal different species identities to potential mates and territorial rivals, preventing the two from accidentally hybridizing into a single blended population and losing the specializations that let each one thrive. Different territories reduce direct competition for the same prey. Different hunting strategies allow both to flourish on the same continent without one driving the other into extinction. This is exactly the pattern the multi-species Homo world would follow. Neanderthals in the cold forests, Denisovans in the mountains, Erectus in the tropical lowlands, Floresiensis on the islands, sapiens filling the temperate spaces between them, each with their own crest, their own body plan, their own cognitive architecture, their own way of signalling to everyone who sees them exactly what kind of human they are, each specialized enough to hold their ground against generalists who might otherwise absorb them. The broader Spinosaur radiation revealed in the study shows a three-phase evolutionary history: a Jurassic origin phase where the characteristic fish-snaring skull shape first emerged, long, narrow jaws lined with conical teeth, more like a crocodile than a typical theropod dinosaur. An early Cretaceous expansion, as they became dominant semi-aquatic predators around the ancient Tethys Sea, filling the ecological role that crocodilians would later inherit, and a late Cretaceous peak, achieving their largest sizes as shallow water ambush specialists across North Africa and South America as the Atlantic Ocean opened between those continents. This stepwise pattern, adapt, expand, specialize, mirrors the diversification of Homo species across different environments over the last 2 million years. First, the basic toolkit: bipedalism, tool use, fire. Then the expansion out of Africa into new continents and new climates. Then the specialization: Neanderthals for cold, Denisovans for altitude, Floresiensis for island scarcity, sapiens for networking and abstraction. Same evolutionary logic, different scale, different creatures separated by 93 million years and an asteroid. But the principle is identical. When there is room, life fills it, and the filling produces not one perfect form but many imperfect ones, each imperfect in its own way, each perfect for its own niche. The Spinosaurs prove that coexistence is not a fantasy. It is a strategy that evolution has deployed again and again, across hundreds of millions of years, in lineages as different as marine reptiles and bipedal apes. It works, sometimes for tens of millions of years, until something catastrophic empties all the niches at once. The Spinosaurs coexisted for millions of years before the Chicxulub asteroid erased them both. The question for the Homo lineage is whether the catastrophe has already happened, whether the extinction of 8 human species over the past few 100,000 years is the asteroid event of our story, and we are simply living in its aftermath without recognizing it for what it is. Which raises the obvious next question: what happens when those niches do empty? How fast does the lone survivor expand to fill them? The answer turns out to be faster than anyone believed possible. Part 14: Lightning Evolution. After Chicxulub, what happens when niches empty? On January 21st, 2026, a study published in the journal Geology overturned one of the most widely accepted numbers in paleontology, and in doing so, it told us something unsettling about ourselves and the world we inhabit. The team was led by Chris Lowry, a research associate professor at the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics, with Timothy Brallower of Penn State, Kenneth Farley of Caltech, and Mark Leckie of the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Their subject was the immediate aftermath of the worst day in the history of complex life on Earth, the Chicxulub asteroid impact 66 million years ago, which killed roughly 75% of all species on the planet, including every non-avian dinosaur, most marine reptiles, the ammonites, and vast swaths of the plankton that form the base of the ocean food chain. The accepted estimate for recovery had stood for years. The first new species appeared approximately 30,000 years after the impact. 30,000 years of emptiness, of vacant niches, of an ocean with almost nothing alive in it, drifting under a sky choked with dust and acid rain, before life gathered itself and began to rebuild. The problem, and this is the kind of problem that makes careers when someone finally notices it, was that this estimate relied on an assumption nobody had properly tested, that sediment accumulated on the ocean floor at the same rate before and after the extinction event. It did not even close. The mass die-off of calcareous plankton, which normally sink to the seafloor in astronomical numbers and form a significant portion of marine sediment, combined with a massive spike in land erosion after vegetation collapsed worldwide, dramatically altered how fast sediment accumulated. The geological clock everyone had been reading for decades was running at the wrong speed. Lowry's team used helium-3 to recalibrate that clock. Helium-3 is a rare isotope that arrives on Earth at a constant rate from interplanetary dust, tiny particles drifting in from the solar system, remnants of ancient collisions between asteroids and comets, settling through the atmosphere at a pace that has not changed appreciably in billions of years and embedding in ocean sediment regardless of what is happening on the planet's surface. It is in effect a cosmic metronome, a clock set by the solar system itself, indifferent to whether the planet below it is thriving or dying. More helium-3 per unit of sediment means the sediment accumulated slowly, which means more time is compressed into each centimetre of core sample. Less helium-3 means faster accumulation and less time per centimetre. By measuring the concentration of this isotope at precise intervals through the sediment cores, you can reconstruct how much real time each layer of mud represents, and therefore how long the recovery actually took. The team applied this method to existing sediment core data from 6 sites spanning Europe, North Africa, and the Gulf of Mexico. Data that had been collected years ago, stored in university laboratories, and never been analysed this way because no one had thought to ask this particular question with this particular tool. The results were not a small correction. They were a demolition of the previous timeline. The marker species Parvularugo globigerina eugubina, a tiny foraminifera plankton used as the standard indicator for post-extinction recovery in marine sediments around the world, evolved between 3,500 and 11,000 years after impact, averaging just 6,400 years across the 6 sites. Other plankton species appeared in under 2,000 years. 2,000 years. That is less time than separates us from the Roman Empire, and in that span, entirely new species of complex life emerged from the wreckage of the worst catastrophe this planet has experienced in the last 250 million years. Chris Lowry described the speed as ridiculously fast, and he was not exaggerating, he was understating. Normally, new species emerge on timescales of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Timothy Brallower called the speed of recovery a demonstration of just how resilient life is, noting that having complex life re-established within what amounts to a geologic heartbeat is truly astounding. Life does not wait politely for conditions to improve. It rushes into emptiness the way water rushes into a hole. Now here is why this matters for our story, why a study about plankton 66 million years ago connects directly to a world with 9 kinds of human being. In our timeline, 8 human species went extinct over the past few 100,000 years. Some were absorbed by interbreeding, their genes diluted into a larger population until nothing recognizable remained. Some were outcompeted for resources in the same territories. Some were killed by climate, by droughts, and cold snaps and sea level changes that erased their habitat. Some may have been killed by us, directly, deliberately, in wars we will never find evidence for because the losers left no records. When they disappeared, one by one, sapiens expanded to fill every ecological niche a human could possibly occupy. Arctic tundra, tropical rainforest, mountain highlands, desert, grassland, coastline, island chain. 8 billion individuals on every continent, including research stations in Antarctica and submarines under the polar ice. This is the Chicxulub pattern in miniature. When competitors disappear, survivors do not just persist, they explode. They radiate into every available space with a speed that looks, in geological terms, almost frantic. Sapiens' expansion to 8 billion is the post-extinction radiation, We are the plankton, the generalist survivors who evolved at extraordinary speed to fill every niche that opened up when the competition vanished. And like the plankton, we did it so thoroughly and so quickly that within a few thousand years, no one remembered that the niches had ever belonged to anyone else. In the multi-species world, those niches are still occupied. The mountains still belong to the Denisovans, the cold forests still belong to the Neanderthals, the islands still belong to the hobbits, the tropical lowlands still belong to Erectus, the underground caves still belong to Naledi. Sapiens never get their post-extinction expansion. They are successful, certainly, dominant in many domains, inventive, prolific, unstoppable in their ambition to build and connect and create and consume. But they are constrained the way every species in a full ecosystem is constrained, by the presence of others who got there first and who have no intention of leaving, and who hold advantages in their home terrain that no amount of sapiens' cleverness can overcome. You can be the smartest species on the planet and still not be able to breathe at 20,000 feet. You can invent the atomic bomb and still not be able to fight a Neanderthal in a blizzard. Dominance is not the same as omnipotence, and the multi-species world never lets sapiens forget the difference. The Chicxulub study reveals something profoundly uncomfortable about what we consider normal. Our world, one human species, 8 billion strong, occupying every biome from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, feels inevitable. It feels like the natural order of things. It is not. It is the aftermath of an extinction event. It is what happens when one generalist species inherits a planet that used to be full. The multi-species world is the world before the event. We just do not recognize it because we have never known anything else, the way a child raised in a house with no windows does not know that houses usually have them. And that brings us to the king himself, the most studied animal in history, who turns out to be a completely different creature than we imagined. Part 15. T-Rex's 40-year growth. The species we thought we knew. On January 14th, 2026, a study published in the journal PeerJ assembled the largest dataset ever collected for Tyrannosaurus rex, examined it with tools that had never been applied to dinosaur bone before, and discovered that everything we thought we knew about the most famous predator in Earth's history was built on incomplete evidence. The king had been misread. The team T-Rex took 35 to 40 years to reach its full 8-ton adult size, roughly 15 years longer than the previous estimate of about 25 years. Unlike tree rings, dinosaur growth rings only capture the final 10 to 20 years of an animal's life. So the team developed a new statistical method that stitched together growth records from specimens of different ages, like assembling a complete life story from chapters written in different hands. The picture that emerged was an animal that spent most of its decades as a small to medium predator, occupying ecological roles completely different from the apex position we always imagined it filling. Teenage T-Rex, weighing a fraction of adult mass, hunting different prey, moving at different speeds, filling the niche of medium-sized carnivores that were notably absent from the late Cretaceous ecosystem, spent years, perhaps decades, being something other than the monster we put on our lunchboxes and movie posters. Holly Woodward explained that instead of growing quickly, T-Rex spent most of its life in the mid-body size range, an animal of patience and slow transformation, rather than the explosive growth engine we had assumed. There was another surprise buried in the data, and it echoes the central question of this entire story. 2 specimens nicknamed Jane and Petey showed growth curves that were statistically incompatible with the other 15 T-Rex specimens in the dataset. Their bones told a different story, different growth rates, different timing, different trajectories through life. While growth data alone cannot definitively prove a separate species, this incompatibility supports the possibility that some fossils long classified as juvenile T-Rex actually belong to a separate species called Nanotyrannus, a smaller tyrannosaur that lived alongside the king rather than simply being the king's awkward teenage phase. A separate 2025 analysis by Lindsay Zano and Nick Napoli at North Carolina State University independently classified Jane and Petey as 2 distinct Nanotyrannus species, using entirely different analytical methods, different data, different statistical approaches, same conclusion. Zano noted that this was the second study in just a few months to support the conclusion that some specimens thought to be juvenile Tyrannosaurus are in fact a different animal altogether. The king may not be alone on his throne. There may be a smaller cousin standing beside him, a cousin we kept mistaking for his child, the way we keep mistaking complexity for simplicity, because simplicity is easier to put in a textbook and easier to fit on a museum placard. This is the closing metaphor, and it applies directly to everything we have spent these 2 hours discussing. Pay attention, because this is the thread that ties the whole thing together. Tyrannosaurus rex, the most studied dinosaur in the history of science, the animal every child can name, the creature we thought we understood completely down to the last bone, turns out to be a different animal than we imagined. It grew slower, it lived longer, it spent most of its existence being something other than the apex predator of our imagination, decades as a mid-sized hunter, filling ecological roles we never thought to look for because we were so focused on the 8-ton monster at the end of the growth curve. And it might not even be one species, it might be several, living side by side, lumped together because we assumed there could only be one king. Because our minds default to singularity. One apex predator, one dominant species, one kind of human. We did the same thing to ourselves. We thought we knew what human meant. One species, one destiny, one trajectory from cave to skyscraper. But the real human story involves at least 9 species, each spending most of their existence being something we never bothered to imagine. We lumped them under extinct ancestors, the way paleontologists lumped Jane and Petey under T-Rex, because we assumed there could only be one dominant form, one winner, one survivor, one kind of mind that mattered. The multi-species world does not just ask, what if they survived? It asks a harder question, one that does not go away when you close this video. What did we become by being alone? Our creativity, our networking, our population explosion, our environmental destruction. These are all consequences of having no competition. We filled every niche because no one else was there to fill it. We became everything because we had to be everything. We domesticated ourselves, flattened our brow ridges, shrank our teeth, learned to tolerate strangers by the millions. Because being friendly was the only way to scale a civilization on a planet we had emptied of every other human who might have helped us balance the weight of it. In the multi-species world we would be less numerous, less dominant, less destructive, but we would also be less alone. And the planet, with its mammoths wandering Siberian forests that no one clear-cut, with its hobbits hunting pygmy elephants on islands that no one industrialized, with its Neanderthal craftsmen working stone in ways we cannot replicate, with its Denisovan families living above the clouds where we cannot breathe, that planet would be incomparably richer for having kept all its children instead of losing all but one. Every species that vanished took with it a way of seeing, a way of thinking, a way of being human that will never exist again. Not because it was inferior, because the rain stopped, or the migration shifted, or the demographics tilted, and the math that followed was as cold and indifferent as the math that governs everything else in nature. The question is not what if they survived. The question is what did we lose when they did not, and whether, knowing what we now know, knowing how close the margin was, how a slightly different migration pattern or a slightly shorter drought could have changed everything. Whether we can look at the one species of human being left on this planet and finally understand how rare, how accidental, and how fragile that survival truly is. We are not the chosen species. We are not the inevitable species. We are the species that happened to be standing when the music stopped. And we have spent the last 50,000 years rearranging the furniture in a house that was built for 9 families and now holds only 1. The empty rooms are still there. We just stopped noticing them. The alarm goes off tomorrow morning. You reach for your phone. The faces in the newsfeed all look like yours. They did not have to.